we did get a few questions already. I do have the first one. You know, where are things in the Volkswagen settlement process in Connecticut in reference to placing priorities for electric buses, and any next steps around school boards and municipal community access funds directly being managed right now?
So we are tracking what we know so far about each state plan that has released that information. And for Connecticut, just looking at our tracking document here, doesn't look like that plan, Connecticut's plan, prioritizes electrification, and nor do they prioritize electric transit buses. So that's what I understand about Connecticut. I personally do not work in that state. My colleagues, I have a colleague that does. So if anyone has a specific question about Connecticut, they can reach out to me and I can connect you with the person that can help answer with a little more detail in regards to that plan.
Great. Do any of the other panelists, do you want to add anything to that? Nope. Okay. And thank you for asking that question, and thank you for that response. We had another clarification question on one of the presentations that referenced the clean diesel calculator tool. I'm just wondering where that can be found. Hi, Susan.
Hi. We're going to put the link up. We don't know the long call number by itself, but we will put it up momentarily.
Great. Thank you. So we'll make sure that the link gets shared. Let's see, we did have another question come in about the reliability and distance of electric buses. The question was, in our state, we get questions quite often about the reliability and distance of clean buses. Can you just expand on that? And I think maybe Bethany and Susan, you both would be excellent panelists to take a stab at that question.
Sure. So this is Bethany, and I'll start off. In terms of the distance or the travel range of the vehicles, the Lion Bus buses that we purchased were advertised as having a 75-mile range, and they have realized that range. We haven't had a problem with that. We operated them in cold weather, on hills, in rural communities and urban communities, and everything, that range was pretty consistent across all of the test cases. It's also true that we found that the range increased with experience with the vehicles. So the longer the drivers had been driving the vehicles, they started to see a longer range. We attribute a lot of that to the regenerative braking and getting familiar with that. In terms of reliability, we did have some, as I mentioned in my presentation, we absolutely had some reliability issues. I think that the technology is improving, and we were the first vehicles in the United States that Lion Bus delivered, so for sure that had a factor to that. Also, there was a lot of a learning curve, getting used to the technology and understanding how it worked. And we have been, working with Lion Bus to address all of the reliability issues that we face. So my hope and expectation is that the better products are coming out soon. And Susan, I don't know, did you want to jump in on that as well?
Yes, thank you. All I wanted to add was that we've spoken with the people in Minnesota who are operating a newer Lion Bus than the ones that were available when you started the pilot in Massachusetts. And the reports that we are getting from Minnesota are that the bus has performed exceptionally well, better than expected, exceeded all expectations. So as Bethany mentioned earlier, the newer buses, things change and they upgrade and make improvements as they go along. So we are very optimistic that the buses that would be gotten with VW funds will be even better and be well experienced on the roads.
And we actually have two follow-up questions that are related to the reliability question. So you both might also be good to answer these two, specifically about the safety of electric buses in different weather conditions and the ability for those buses to navigate different terrains based on their battery and engines in comparison to traditional buses. Can you speak on that?
Sure. So Massachusetts has pretty harsh climate, and the temperatures, can swing from maybe -10, -15, all the way up to 100. We also have snow and ice, and the buses have performed really well in those conditions. One of the things that we did do was, or many of the operators will do, is if it's snowy and icy, they'll turn off the regenerative braking, gives them a little more control in some of those hazardous conditions, but there have been no complaints at all about the handling of the vehicle or the safety. In terms of terrain, so I think somebody who asked that question was from Reno and the Sierra Nevadas for sure. The East Coast doesn't have mountains anywhere near that, but we do had some hilly terrain, and the buses have pretty good zip and pickup and acceleration power. So we did not have experienced any complaints with that aspect of the vehicles. So hopefully that answers. I don't know, Susan.
Susan, do you have anything to add?
Not on that one, thanks.
Okay, great. We did have another question about where the process is at in New Jersey. Mary, I don't know if you have any updates to also share on that based on, I know, just the other work that Sierra Club is doing, or if anyone else has anything to add specific to that process.
Yeah, sure. So New Jersey is really interesting because there was a switch in the governor. We lost Chris Christie, thankfully, and got a new governor whose name is eluding me. And so there was a lot of effort to bring that governor up to speed about the Volkswagen settlement. So things have rather been stalled. They did just have a public comment period end a week ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago. The Department of Environmental Protection is the lead agency, and the let me just see if there's been no draft plan released yet. So even though the public comment period has ended, it looks like, well, we expect a draft plan to be released at some point, although we don't know when. There's no indication, at least from the information I have, about when we'll be able to see a draft plan.
Thank you. And do any other panelists have anything to add to that? Okay, thank you. Next question is in reference to school districts that contract out their bus fleets and bus services, and versus school districts that manage their own bus fleets. The question asker is curious, to experience navigating those different levels of fleet management, and if there are any suggestions for navigating that with advocacy and messaging. Bethany, would you like to answer that question?
Sure, I can help out with that. So in Massachusetts, we had 3 buses. 2 were deployed at school districts that operated their own service, and 1 at a contracting service. And the Minnesota bus that Susan has referred to is also operated by a private contractor. So obviously there's no problems. Anybody can operate any kind of school district. In terms of allocating the money, that may be a little bit trickier. But one thing I would say is that part of it is looking at the contract itself. And also in New York, one of the buses is operated by a private contractor. So we've seen a lot of interest from the private sector in trying the new technologies, deploying them, and they've been willing to experiment. And so there is no reason why you couldn't work with a private contractor. It's still public funds that get distributed through to the contractor. I don't know, Susan, if you have any other insights, but from my perspective, there's no reason why you can't work with a contractor.
We absolutely agree, Bethany. The experience that we're seeing across the Midwest, where we had a tour last summer in 4 states and 6 cities, is that there is interest among both contractors and school districts that run their own buses in obtaining and operating and running clean zero-emission school buses.
Great, thank you. I had another follow-up question come through about risk or problem, possible risks or problems with any toxins from battery leaks or corrosion with electric buses. Bethany or Dr. Wilson, could you speak on that point or provide any feedback? Or any of the panelists that would.
So I can defer to Dr. Wilson about that. I would just say that the batteries are really well protected, and so there shouldn't be any leaks or corrosions. If anybody can take a look at an electric school bus if it comes to visit, but you'll see they're super well protected. So the hazards may be there, but they shouldn't happen.
Yeah, I have nothing to add.
Great, thank you both for responding to that question. We also received a couple questions about the other options that the Volkswagen settlement monies are eligible for, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for example, or public transit, and any thoughts about prioritizing school buses over those, or kind of the broader picture. Susan, would you like to respond to that question?
Certainly. First of all, we at the Environmental Law and Policy Center and many of our environmental colleagues across the Midwest are in favor of states using the 15% set aside that's allowed for electric vehicle infrastructure. So this is not an only one thing kind of a choice. Mary's presentation showed that that was easy for states to do, and it's the only part of the VW settlement where there's a cap on how much can be spent. So 15% can be spent for electric vehicle light duty infrastructure, charging stations in other words, and we are all supporting that. In terms of the other 85%, as Mary alluded to, there are a number of possible uses. And the reason that we are supporting electric school buses predominantly relate to the health issues that Dr. Wilson referred to, but also because transit buses, which we are supportive of and consistently support city transit agencies getting funds for, there are federal pots of money already available for electric transit buses. But there are not federal pots of money available for electric school buses. And the technology has not been as far along up until recently for school buses, and yet we have the situation that Dr. Wilson pointed out, that children are the most vulnerable population. So we've got this confluence now of the technology now being available, funds being available for the first time in large measure to help make this transition. I just wanted to mention that we posted the information in the chat function to get to the calculator and also get to the school board resolution. So I hope people can see those. If not, you can go to ELPC's website, our VW page, and those resources are posted.
Thank you, Susan. We had another question come in on how long it will take for an electric school bus to be paid for or covered by the Volkswagen settlement. Bethany, would you like to answer this question?
Sure. So in terms of the return on investment, an electric school bus takes a while. It takes, because the fuel is saved, the delta between the fuel costs, it is cheaper to operate, but it's not that much cheaper to operate, so it takes a long time. I would say longer than the expected lifespan of a vehicle to pay for itself based on fuel and a little bit of maintenance. The VW fund, so if you can reduce some of that, the cost of the vehicle. So when we've looked at it, a diesel bus costs around $100,000, electric school bus costs $325,000. That's a big delta to try to make up with cheaper fuel and lower maintenance costs. If you can get it down to about $100,000, $50,000, then you're starting to look at a return on investment that's more financially feasible for a school.
And one additional follow-up question that might be connected to that, do you have any knowledge of any other funds that kind of complement the Volkswagen funds? This person is asking specific to the East Coast with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative or other opportunities, but can you speak on that as well?
So I can a little bit. I don't think it's a very satisfying answer, but the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI as it's called, it is available in the Northeast to the states that are participating in that. Most of those, I would say talk to your state about looking into those funds. Each state has its own program. Most of the funds are pretty well accounted for, but there occasionally are resources that can be used for innovations.
And then any other funds that may be available outside of the East Coast?
Well, so DERA is, the Diesel Emission Reduction Act is a funding source that can be used to replace diesel buses with cleaner fuel technology vehicles. And that can be up to, I think, 45% of the cost of the vehicle, so I would look into that. We also saw, and Susan, you can speak a little bit to this as well, and we have a profile of this project up on our website, is that in some cases utilities have been interested in electrification, and they have even brought money to the table and been willing to partner to get a school bus on the road. So the Minnesota bus was funded in 3 parts. 1/3 by the school contractor, so the private sector investment, and then 2/3 from 1/3 from one utility and another third from another utility. So the utilities paid for 2/3 of the cost, the contractor paid 1/3 of the cost, and then that's how they got their bus. So we have seen some innovative funding. California has other funding sources. They've been able to get more buses on the road more quickly.
So in addition to everything Bethany said, which I absolutely agree with, we've also noted that in New York, Con Ed is paying for a pilot, and each utility has the option to come up with funds to help electric school buses on the road. In different states, the rules around how utilities can participate differ. And in Con Ed's case, they found that they could amass school buses in a way that could prevent them having to pay for a new substation, which is a substantial undertaking. So they could justify putting the school buses into the rate base. In other places, there are other possibilities through rate structure. So what we definitely urge people to be in touch. If you know somebody in your local utility, to present the idea to them, call upon a local group to help you if needed, but to urge the utilities to consider this, the ways that they could contribute to reducing the upfront costs of an electric school bus. In some situations, utilities are thinking that they could actually buy the batteries, which are the most expensive portion of the bus. I think Bethany may correct me, but I think it's somewhere between 60 and 80% of an electric school bus cost is the batteries. And those batteries then could be leased back to the school, which would make a significantly lower upfront cost for the schools. We agree with the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 strategy that Bethany also mentioned. So those are some other possibilities.
Can I chime in real quick?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so just on the issue of the overall impacts, and I mentioned the whole issue of cumulative impacts, I think the DURA funds are great. So a lot of communities that I was alluding to, their communities you have children who are on these school buses that also have, you know, goods movement. They may be in the port community where there's a lot of port-related vehicles. And so I think it's important to think about the overall investment in reducing these burdens, because that's an equity issue. So to me, I think that has to be part of the discussion about the equity issue, because some school districts may not have the resources to buy a lot of the buses. And these are schools where kids may have a lot of asthma. So you have to take that into account when you think about health disparities. And then at the same time, the context of being by a lot of industrial hazards and a lot of fleet vehicles. So I think we have to think about those issues too when it comes to Reggie funds investment, DURA fund investments, and now these VW fund investments, to make sure that we're targeting the right school districts and the right communities who may already have limited resources.
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
We absolutely agree with what Dr. Wilson just said, and that's one reason why we are strongly advocating that states do a specific carve out for electric school buses, that they match at least with VW funds the amount that a school district or school bus contractor would have paid for a so-called new clean diesel bus. That can get you to then 2/3 of the cost, and then if a utility or local foundation or others can kick in, the schools can then get the new electric school bus basically at parity with a so-called clean diesel bus. That's what we're advocating for, and we would urge that those of you who can be active with your school districts and your school boards be pushing in that direction.
Great, thank you. I have a question that I think would be good for Dr. Wilson, you to answer. Is it too early to tell if electrification improves health outcomes for children compared to diesel bus riders, or are there studies in the works on this?
I'm not sure about the studies, but I do think we need studies. And I think it'll be important to look at that sort of cost benefit analysis and to do that work. And so I think in the places where we've had the transition, that there are study designs that we could employ to see if we're actually getting that out. And I think maybe some of the other panelists may have some input on whether or not we're seeing those health benefits.
Yeah, so Molly, this is Bethany. I could jump in a minute on that. So I think it's hard to tell because the buses haven't been in service for that long, and measuring those things can be pretty complicated. But in Massachusetts, we did do a very short pilot where we tested the air quality temperature inside of the bus, because one of the problems with the diesel buses is that a lot of the fumes are inside the cabin. So it's not a matter of just being outside of the bus and being exposed to the fume, but actually the kids sitting in the bus are exposed to a lot of fumes. So, toxic chemicals. So we have done some testing. I don't have any results just yet, but that is something that we're going to look into. And I think as more buses get on the road, this is going to be something that we start to look at more seriously, because Dr. Wilson is right. And the original electric school bus pilots, the first one that happened in California, in sort of the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. And one of the key motivators was they had a high percentage of the school population was free and reduced lunch, which is a measure of poverty, and then also very, very high asthma rates. So the potential to have an impact was pretty significant, and that was a significant motivator for the pilot and getting started. So we really want to see those benefits. VW is an excellent opportunity to start to be a little bit more equitable, because you get 100% of the cost paid. You don't have to be from a wealthy school district to try it.
Can I jump in here also?
Yes.
One of the, in addition to all the work that Bethany mentioned, we have worked with Dr. Sarah Adar from the University of Michigan School of Public Health. She's the one who did the research years ago looking at diesel school buses based on work studying buses in Seattle, and found that children riding diesel school buses experience reduced lung development, which, as Dr. Wilson pointed out, is a big problem, and increased school day absenteeism. Her research, when she looked at what it meant nationwide, indicated that if we get children out of dirty school buses, currently diesel, into cleaner buses, we could save 14 million school day absences per year. She is now willing and able to do some testing of electric school buses to show a contrast. She visited and worked with Bethany for 1 week to look at some of the buses in Massachusetts, and has expressed an interest with us. We've proposed a pilot in Michigan, and she's willing to do testing of electric school buses. So, by the way, is the National Renewable Energy Lab based in Colorado. They're interested in looking at the efficiency so that we can show the benefits of many types of electric school buses. One other thing I wanted to add is that recent analyses have found that diesel in-use emissions are much higher than the laboratory certification results. This option is available to provide sensitivity cases as compared to the default MOVE model. So that's what I mentioned earlier today, the new argon information.
Great, thank you. We had another question specifically about the Volkswagen settlement funds and how to make sure that new buses get used for students that live in vulnerable communities. Who would like to answer that question?
Well, I can jump in real quick. I think it falls up to the point that I was making earlier. And I think there's multiple ways you can do it. So it may vary state by state, but one tool that I think would be useful would be the EPA's Environmental Justice Screening Tool. So EJ Screen is a tool that the EPA developed to basically map communities that may have higher environmental risk. So it takes into account hazard data, pollution data, facility data, social demographic data. So that's one tool that you can use those maps and say, hey, where are the areas we have vulnerable communities? A tool that's also really good that actually gives you an environmental justice score is the Cal Enviro Screen tool. And so in Cal Enviro Screen, it has 4 categories. It looks at exposures, environmental effects, sensitive populations, and social demographics. So you can get a score for each subcategory, and you can get an EJ score for overall score, a cumulative score. And so you can map that data out and say, well, based on this data, we believe that some vulnerable populations, it brings in asthma data. It also looks at cancer risk data. It looks at traffic proximity and diesel exhaust. So you even just zoom in and map this diesel exhaust risk data and some other variables, and then see those areas where you had that high traffic proximity or the high diesel exhaust, and then say, well, those are communities that we want to target because we have routes that go through those areas where they already have background levels of pollution, they have background hazards, and you also can even bring some other types of approaches like land use regression to look at traffic-related air. So there's multiple ways you can do it, but I think the EJ screen tool and as a national tool is probably the first place to start, and then trying to replicate what California has done, because I like how you can score. Doesn't mean that it's a relative score. It's a ranking. It doesn't mean that you're the worst. It's absolute. It's just how you compare to the rest of the state. So that's a way I think to start, to rank areas that need these investments.
I'd just like to add, I agree with Dr. Wilson. Another simple thing that one can do is to look at the attainment status of the air quality in your state. Each state has had to report to EPA over the years its air quality numbers. And so each metropolitan area is either in attainment, which means supposedly the air is clean enough. One can question whether the standards are good enough, as we do, but if the area is in what's called non-attainment status, then for sure it's not clean enough and not healthy enough. And those areas tend to be areas where the vulnerable populations, low income and minority people tend to end up, unfortunately, in those areas. So if you've got a non-attainment area, as for instance in Ohio, as they were doing their draft plan, they created priority counties. And you might ask your state, as it's working through its planning, to prioritize the non-attainment counties. And for the most part, that will, in general, help and help focus money on low-income and minority vulnerable populations.
Yeah, and just, can I add one thing quickly?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, and then you can go back. So I just wanted to say that it's good to have tools and screening and prioritize these areas, but I would also recommend reaching out to them and talking to them about the funds, make sure that they know that the funding's available, that it's not an arduous application process, that there's new technologies, that they can get a free school bus. When we did our recruiting in Massachusetts, it was kind of like the usual suspects applied for the funding because those schools had more, they just had more resources. So it was easier for them to participate in a pilot project. And then we did hear from other school districts like, oh, why does all the money always, so I think part of it is that beholden on us to help states figure out what school districts could benefit from the program, and then calling them, encouraging them to apply, providing resources to help them with the application process, and then just guiding them through the process. Don't expect that they're going to necessarily have the resources to raise their hand.
And some other, from a public health perspective, some other tools to kind of rank vulnerable populations would be the National County Health Rankings System. Just look at health data at the county level across the country through Robert Wood Johnson. And then there's a Robert Wood Johnson for metropolitan statistical areas. There's a Robert Wood Johnson CDC 500 city study where they have health data available down to the tract level. So it could be another way to kind of map out areas that have high asthma prevalence, for example. I also think from my background in looking at environmental justice issues, there's a lot of community-based organizations and networks of groups that are working on, pollution issues, pollution disparities, and partnering with those groups, whether it be groups in California, like the West Oakland Indicators Project that works on port issues, Asia Pacific Islander Environmental Network. You have We Act for Environmental Justice in New York. You have groups in Michigan. You have groups in South Carolina. You have the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. Those groups are all in many ways working in communities that are overburdened by hazards that have multiple pollution sources. So partnering with them to partner with school districts, because they already are targeting those very vulnerable populations in their work to eliminate hazards, improve environmental quality, and also improve health outcomes. So that's infrastructure that can be tapped into as well. And I think what's emerging too as sort of a sister to that is the fact there's a lot of groups that are doing citizen science work. There's a lot of now low-cost sensors that are out there, so we can actually have community members putting out sensors to look at particulates in areas where you have a lot of school bus traffic. There's sensors that are out there that can measure particulate matter. They can measure volatile organic compounds. There's real-time continuous sensors that can be used for the purposes. So we can partner with school districts. They can put their own sensors on and say, hey, this is what's happening to our kids. When we have buses idling, we see PM levels go up. These sensors are pretty cheap. They give you a nice indication of what's going on in the atmosphere, and then they can make some adjustments. And this is another reason why we have investments in new school buses in our district.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions remaining. One is specific to percentage of diesel or toxic emissions that can be taken off the road by an electric bus, taking into consideration that idle stations and bus lots, especially in the winter when buses are running, can also contribute to a lot of that pollution. Susan or Bethany, do either of you want to expand on that?
Sure, you can. I think there's some tools available. Susan, you might be able to point us to that to calculate that number. It does vary by state and based on the fuel mix of your grid and things like that. But the number can be fairly easily calculated. We've calculated it for a couple of states. I don't have the national number off the top of my head, though.
The Argonne tool that I mentioned and typed into the chat function is a great new resource specifically to answer those questions. Yeah, I read that.
Great, thank you. And we also received a question on, given the opportunity the Volkswagen settlement provides for communities, especially those that are experiencing a lot of poor air quality or air pollution, how can we continue building momentum to engage low-income communities of color, to make sure that the change we achieve through the Volkswagen settlement directly benefits them? And I think Dr. Wilson, you talked a little bit about this earlier, but just wanted to provide an opportunity to expand on that specifically as participants turn to do this work in their communities.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you go back to my earlier point about how a lot of low-income communities of color are overburdened by environmental hazards, those cumulative impacts, and some of the reasons why they have some of these pollution-intensive industries is because of divestment and disinvestment, right? So we can see the VW settlement funds as a clean energy investment. So how can we package that investment with other investment packages that are already out there? So community development block grants, right? Think about looking at tax incremental funding. We have effort, I mentioned Bladensburg briefly in my comments, but we have this whole eco-district concept where they're trying to create an eco-district in Bladensburg. And the whole idea is, how can we make sure we have congruent uses when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to improving health outcomes, transportation, pedestrian infrastructure, economic opportunities. So it's about building healthy community ecosystems and using these funds as part of an overall investment package to reinvest in low-income communities of color who over multiple decades have had divestment and been attractive areas for what I call pathogenic infrastructure, pollution-intensive infrastructure. So I think that sort of approach to building a healthy community ecosystem, this is just one piece of the ecosystem, but there are other pieces too that we need to focus on. And I think that way, to me, we're talking about doing more green development, more sustainable development, more equitable development, and bringing those frameworks to those communities. The other panelists want to chime in?
I was just going to say the other thing when you were talking that I kept thinking about was resiliency as well, which is a major factor for many of those communities. They're being impacted by climate change more than anybody else. And so I think you're right. We got to create a healthy ecosystem that's safe, healthy, resilient, sustainable. So all of that it all works together. It's a great argument. It's really well needed. And these are communities that have been underinvested in over the years. I would also say that to build momentum is information. You know, there's the more information that you can provide, and I think many of us on the panel here would love to participate in any way that we can to help you with information, put together packages, get your message out there, and get these, help these communities along, because it's they're often slower to respond to grant funds and things like that, so we can help try to stem that tide.
And it's to jump in. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I'll jump back in.
Okay. Go on.
Oh, I was going to say, so we have a national environmental justice leadership initiative on climate change. So we're talking about resiliency. You have groups across the country who do environmental justice work, who are doing climate justice work, and they're doing resiliency work. This fits in exactly to what they're doing. I'm actually part of a Gulf Coast consortium. This Dr. Robert Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright one's at Texas Southern, one's at Dillard University. And so they're working on looking at environmental justice issues in the Gulf Coast and really around natural disasters, man-made disasters, and these hazards, but really, how do you make communities more resilient to improve health outcomes? So I think we can tap into networks, consortium, groups who are already doing this work and bring this as another thing they can advocate for. We already have a very powerful advocacy infrastructure within those communities, and this would be more resources that can be invested in the communities and really empower those communities, right? We're talking about information. How can we empower people with this information to raise awareness, and then they can be more engaged in their own placemaking, right? And they can be more engaged in really actualizing their own vision.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And, we do have to wrap up the webinar. It's getting close to the end of the hour, but I do want to thank everyone for joining today, all the panelists and your thoughtful responses and presentations, for being here with Chispa, Sierra Club, Environmental Law and Policy Center, and the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, and Dr. Wilson. Thank you for joining us. We did leave in the chat a link to where the recording will be posted in the coming days on the cleanride4kids.org website. So please check the comments there for those of you that asked for next steps and follow-up that may have missed parts of the webinar or want to refer back to it. And in the coming weeks, of course, this is an important campaign for all of our partners and the work that we'll be doing in the States. We'd love to partner with any and all of the webinar participants, all of the communities that are working on these issues, and work together. So we'll be reaching out to webinar participants and other stakeholders in our communities to talk about what you've learned and what you thought about the webinar and how we might be able to partner together as we move forward. So thank you everyone for your time and for participating today, and for all of the panelists and your expertise. And have a wonderful afternoon.